For centuries, one of North America's greatest civilizations seemed to leave behind an impossible mystery. Its people constructed enormous stone buildings several stories high in one of the driest landscapes on the continent. They engineered roads that stretched for hundreds of miles across deserts and cliffs. They aligned ceremonial structures with the movements of the sun and moon with astonishing precision. Then, sometime in the late 12th century, they simply left. There was no volcanic eruption, no invading empire, no evidence of a city consumed by war, only silent buildings, abandoned almost exactly as they had stood for generations. To early archaeologists, the conclusion seemed obvious. The people had vanished. But what if that mystery never really existed? What if archaeologists spent more than a century trying to explain a disappearance that never happened? Because today, ancient DNA, archaeology, environmental science, and the voices of living indigenous communities are telling a very different story. And it forces us to ask whether history has been chasing the wrong question all along. Hidden among the sandstone cliffs of northwestern New Mexico lies Chaco Canyon, one of the most extraordinary archaeological landscapes in North America. Even today, standing among its ruins feels almost surreal. Nothing about this place should exist. Rainfall is scarce. Farming has always been difficult. Timber is limited. Yet beginning around the 9th century, thousands of people transformed this harsh canyon into the ceremonial heart of an enormous regional network. They built what archaeologists call great houses, immense stone structures assembled from hundreds of thousands of carefully shaped sandstone blocks. Some contained hundreds of rooms rising several stories above the canyon floor. Their masonry remains so precise that many walls still stand after nearly 1,000 years. Nearby were vast ceremonial kivas built partially underground, capable of gathering large communities for rituals whose meanings are only partly understood today. But perhaps the strangest feature wasn't the buildings, it was the roads. Radiating outward from Chaco, these engineered routes stretched across deserts and mesas for hundreds of miles. They often ignored the easiest paths, climbing steep cliffs in remarkably straight lines instead of following natural terrain. If they were designed only for trade, they made remarkably little practical sense. Many archaeologists now believe these roads serve ceremonial and political purposes as much as economic ones, connecting sacred landscapes and distant communities into a single cultural world, which immediately raises a difficult question. Who possessed enough authority to organize something on this scale? For decades, archaeologists offered a surprisingly simple answer. Perhaps no one. A long-standing interpretation imagined Chaco as a loose alliance of relatively equal farming communities cooperating voluntarily without powerful rulers or hereditary elites. Monumental construction, according to this view, emerged through shared religious traditions and communal labor, rather than centralized political authority. It was an attractive explanation. It also reflected broader assumptions that many indigenous societies before European contact were largely decentralized and politically egalitarian. Under this model, Chaco flourished for centuries before prolonged drought eventually forced its inhabitants to leave. Elegant, logical, and as later discoveries would suggest, probably incomplete. The first cracks in that interpretation appeared inside one remarkable building, Pueblo Bonito, the largest great house in Chaco Canyon. For decades, archaeologists excavated room after room inside its massive walls, uncovering architecture unlike anything else in prehistoric North America. Then they reopened a chamber known simply as Room 33. What they found would eventually reshape the entire debate. Unlike ordinary burials discovered elsewhere in the Southwest, the individuals interred here rested among extraordinary wealth. Turquoise ornaments, shell jewelry carried from distant coastlines, ceremonial objects, exotic materials rarely seen in other graves. Even before modern science entered the picture, archaeologists recognized that these individuals had occupied an exceptional position within Chaco society. Yet one critical question remained unanswered. Were these simply unrelated high-status individuals buried together over time? Or were they members of the same ruling family? For decades, no one could say. The skeletons had already revealed everything archaeology alone could provide. The next breakthrough would come from an entirely different field: genetics. Ancient DNA extracted from several individuals buried inside Room 33 produced a result few researchers expected. The elite burial shared the same mitochondrial lineage. That alone was intriguing. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child, making it possible to trace maternal ancestry across generations. But the real surprise lay in the timeline. The shared lineage continued for roughly 3 centuries. Generation after generation, members of the same maternal family were laid to rest inside Chaco's most prestigious burial chamber. Suddenly, Room 33 no longer looked like an unusual collection of honored individuals. It looked like a dynasty. The discovery did not prove that every community across the Chaco world was ruled by hereditary elites, nor did one burial crypt explain the political structure of an entire civilization. But it shattered one of archaeology's oldest assumptions. Perhaps Chaco had possessed long-lasting leadership after all. If authority remained concentrated within a powerful lineage for centuries, organizing monumental construction no longer seemed nearly as mysterious. The great houses, the vast ceremonial complexes, the astonishing road system, all of them suddenly appeared consistent with a society capable of sustained political coordination across generations. One mystery had begun to resolve, another immediately appeared. If Chaco had developed such a sophisticated system of leadership, where had the ideas come from? The answer may lie hundreds of miles to the south. Archaeologists have uncovered objects in Chaco Canyon that simply could not have originated there. Scarlet macaw feathers, copper bells crafted in Mesoamerica, even traces of cacao, the ceremonial drink associated with elite rituals far to the south. None of these belong naturally in the deserts of the American Southwest. Each represented journeys spanning hundreds of miles through networks connecting societies that spoke different languages, practiced different traditions, and occupied dramatically different environments. These were not ordinary trade goods, they were prestige items, objects carrying social, religious, and political meaning. The similarities extend beyond imported artifacts. Some researchers have pointed to architectural features, ceremonial practices, and broader cultural parallels suggesting that Chaco participated in a much larger sphere of interaction stretching into ancient Mexico. But how far did those connections really go? That remains one of the most hotly debated questions in southwestern archaeology. Some scholars have proposed that influential outsiders introduced new forms of political organization into Chaco Canyon. Others see something very different, not foreign rulers, but local leaders selectively adopting prestigious ideas, rituals, and luxury goods while preserving their own cultural traditions. So far, ancient DNA offers little support for the idea that an outside population governed Pueblo Bonito. Instead, the evidence points towards something more subtle: influence without conquest, exchange without replacement. Ideas can travel astonishing distances without entire populations moving alongside them, and history is filled with societies that borrowed symbols of power while remaining entirely their own. Once again, the evidence resists simple answers. As archaeologists reconstructed Chaco's growing political complexity, another line of evidence painted a far darker picture. Across several sites in the ancient Southwest, researchers encountered human remains unlike ordinary burials. Bones bore cut marks. Some had been intentionally broken. Others showed signs of burning. Certain skeletons appeared to have been carefully disarticulated after death. At sites such as Cowboy Wash, biochemical analyses intensified the controversy even further, leading some researchers to argue that the remains had been processed in ways consistent with cannibalism. The claim attracted enormous attention. It also sparked fierce debate. Were these desperate acts committed during periods of famine, violence connected to political collapse, ritual practices whose original meanings have long since disappeared, or were archaeologists reading far more into damaged bones than the evidence could actually support? Many indigenous communities urged caution. For centuries, accusations of cannibalism had been used to dehumanize native peoples across the Americas. That historical context matters. Archaeology can document physical modifications to skeletal remains. It cannot always explain why those modifications occurred. Responsible researchers therefore distinguish carefully between observable evidence and broader interpretation. The bones reveal that something unusual happened. They do not automatically reveal the story behind it, and that distinction remains essential. Even so, the archaeological record points toward a society experiencing increasing stress. But if violence alone didn't bring Chaco to an end, what did? The answer began to emerge not from the ruins themselves, but from the trees that once surrounded them. Tree ring analysis, one of the most precise dating methods available to archaeologists, revealed that the American Southwest entered a series of prolonged droughts during the 12th century. For Chaco Canyon, the consequences would have been profound. Harvests became increasingly unpredictable. Water grew scarcer. Nearby forests, already heavily exploited for centuries of construction, could no longer supply enough timber. Builders were forced to haul massive beams from mountain ranges dozens of miles away, a logistical challenge that became increasingly difficult as resources dwindled. A society built on regional cooperation now faced pressures from every direction at once. Food production declined. Construction slowed. Long-distance exchange became harder to sustain. Communities that had once depended on one another now had fewer resources to share. History has shown again and again that civilizations rarely collapse because of a single event. Instead, environmental pressure exposes political weaknesses that had remained hidden during prosperous times. Whether Chaco's leadership could no longer maintain regional alliances, whether trade networks gradually dissolved, or whether communities simply chose different paths remains uncertain. But by the late 12th century, something fundamental had changed. People began to leave. Remarkably, the archaeological evidence tells a surprisingly peaceful story. There are no widespread burn layers suggesting catastrophic warfare, no signs of invading armies systematically destroying the great houses, no indication that Chaco was violently erased from history. Instead, many ceremonial spaces appear to have been intentionally sealed. Buildings were carefully closed rather than hastily abandoned. Some doorways were deliberately blocked with masonry. Others were filled with stone as though the structures were being respectfully retired rather than destroyed. This does not look like a civilization caught by surprise. It looks like a society making a conscious decision to move on, which raises an entirely different question. If the people left, where did they go? For generations, Pueblo communities have preserved oral histories describing migrations from ancestral homelands. These accounts tell of families moving across the Southwest as conditions changed, carrying with them ceremonies, agricultural knowledge, sacred responsibilities, and the traditions that defined their communities. The story was never one of extinction. It was one of transformation. For much of the 20th century, however, many Western scholars treated these oral traditions as cultural memory rather than historical evidence. Archaeology focused on abandoned buildings. The living descendants often remained outside the conversation. That has begun to change. Increasingly, researchers are working directly with Pueblo communities, recognizing that archaeology alone cannot fully explain the past of a civilization whose descendants are still here. Ancient DNA has become one of the most powerful tools in that effort. Recent genetic studies conducted in partnership with indigenous communities have identified long-term continuity between ancient populations of the Southwest and modern Pueblo peoples. The findings align remarkably well with centuries of oral tradition. The inhabitants of Chaco did not vanish. They migrated. They reorganized. Their descendants continued building communities elsewhere across the Southwest, carrying their languages, ceremonies, and identities into new homelands. The great buildings remained behind. The civilization did not. That realization changes everything. For more than a century, archaeologists searched for the reason an entire people supposedly disappeared, but the evidence increasingly suggests they were trying to solve the wrong mystery. Stone walls are easy to see. Empty plazas capture the imagination. Abandoned buildings create compelling stories. Yet civilizations are not defined by architecture alone. They endure through families, through language, through memory, through traditions passed from one generation to the next. Chaco Canyon still rises from the New Mexico desert much as it did nearly 1,000 years ago. Its massive sandstone walls continue to catch the first light of dawn and the last light of evening. It remains one of the greatest archaeological landscapes in North America, not because it marks the end of a civilization, but because it preserves a moment of extraordinary transformation. Ancient DNA revealed that leadership was more complex than archaeologists once believed. Archaeology uncovered a regional network whose scale few had imagined. Environmental science explained why change became increasingly difficult to avoid. And indigenous knowledge, long overlooked, helped reveal what may have been true all along. The greatest discovery, then, is not that archaeologists finally solved the disappearance of the ancestral Puebloans. It is that the disappearance itself was largely an illusion. As evidence accumulated from laboratories, excavations, tree rings, and the voices of living communities, it became increasingly clear that history had mistaken abandoned places for abandoned people. Chaco's builders were never lost. They adapted, they endured, and they carried their civilization forward in ways that stone ruins alone could never reveal. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden within Chaco Canyon. The survival of a civilization is measured not only by the monuments it leaves behind, but by the people who continue its story.